My encounter with the hide-behind. By Anonymous. My encounter takes place in Kansas City. I was 19 years old when I happened to encounter something spooky. Sometimes I still can't believe that I even saw anything at all. I live in a small neighborhood with my family. In this small town, where nothing of importance or anything exciting really ever happens, I witnessed something possibly supernatural. I grew up reading about cryptids and monsters and listening to alleged encounters with such entities, but until now, I'd never actually seen anything. I still love hearing stories about Wendigo and dogmen wishing to encounter one. I've always wanted to be the one who saw something. Even if their encounters were dangerous, I wouldn't hesitate to look for one. But I guess I just never got the chance. One evening after work, I was drawing in my bedroom on a freezing night. I usually spend my evenings after work texting my friends and drawing fantasy creatures on my phone to pass the time. At one point, later in the evening, I was reminded by my mom that I needed to take the trash down to the end of the driveway for the garbage truck to pick up the following day. It was a freezing autumn night, and I didn't want to go outside and freeze my ass off, so I waited until I was about to go to bed to take the trash down. We have 5 trash cans that we lead out for the garbage truck, since it's a very big family. I put my jacket on and head downstairs. It's around 11:30 p.m. at this point, and no one else is awake except for me and my dog, Scout. Scout has 2 dog beds, one in the dining room and one by the front door. When I walk downstairs, Scout has her muzzle pressed against the window and is focused on something outside. At the time, I thought it was a raccoon. There was one that lived in the tree on our front lawn. But now that I'm thinking about this encounter, I don't believe that Scout was watching a raccoon. I think nothing about what she might be watching outside, and I head right on out. I walk over in front of the garage doors, grabbing each trash can individually and taking them down to the end of the driveway. I'm putting trash can number 3 down at the end when I hear what I can only describe as a scrabbling noise. It sounds like something is climbing down a tree. Depending on the animal, you can often tell how big it is by the sound when it rises or walks. It didn't sound like a small animal. It sounded rather big, like bare skin on the bark. I turn and see a figure peeking out behind a tree. It's about as tall as me, but the cover of night makes it hard to distinguish this person's facial features or skin color. From the outline that I could see of this person, they were deadly skinny and seemed to be malnourished. I used to be so gullible and tended to make new friends, even with people who didn't like me. It was this gullible friendliness, however, that tipped me off that something was off about this individual. I assumed it was just a homeless person or maybe one of my neighbors. "Hey, sir? Ma'am? What are you doing out at this hour?" I asked politely. The individual in question did not move from their spots, but I could see their breath forming little clouds in the air from the coal. Their left arm was wrapped around the side of the tree trunk facing me. I could barely make out the outline of its bony arm in the near pitch black of the night. I turned away momentarily and pushed trash can number 3 next to the other 2, and when I turned around, the figure was gone. I was baffled. I had only turned around for a split second, and it had disappeared without a sound. I went over and inspected the tree where it had just been standing. The ground had been disturbed where it had stood, and there was a faint mark on the tree from where the person had wrapped its arm. I looked up at the tree and even pointed my phone light up at it. I finished taking the trash cans down quickly because it was freezing out there, and whatever unidentified person was standing in my front yard only a few seconds ago was gone. To this day, I think I saw one of 3 different cryptids. I think it was either a rake, a skinwalker, wendigo, or maybe like a hide-behind. For those who do not know, a hide-behind is an old cryptid that was allegedly seen by loggers in America's early history. Supposedly, a monster hid behind trees and used the trees as cover to hunt for its prey, humans. Supposedly, people did die to attacks from hide-behinds back in the day, but nothing has ever been verified. Descriptions of the hide-behind vary from being a large reptilian to a big, black, furry beast. To this day, I haven't seen it since, and I kind of want to see it again, even if my initial experience was very creepy.
The Creature from the Ritual by Braxton P. Hi, Swamp Dweller. It's been about a month since I last sent in a story about some unusual experiences I've been having. Recently, I've been having crazier things happen on my property. I live in one of the most secluded areas in Georgia. It's nice and private, settling on a few thousand acres with about a 250-acre lake and no neighbors except the local wildlife. It's been family-owned since 1810. As houses have been built and rebuilt, I have had to do further research to discover why these experiences are happening to me and my family. It always appears safe during the daytime, but becomes incredibly different when night comes. During my research, I discovered this property was once a hideout for a local Cherokee tribe. Occasionally, I hear knocking on wood, knocking on the house, possible rocks being thrown below the windows, and so on. My last experience was just last night when the sun was almost out of sight. Coyotes just started becoming more active. I hear them howling and the birds are always whistling. It came to a point when all the animals suddenly went quiet, and the only thing I heard was footsteps crunching on leaves. There are no bears in this area of Georgia, but whatever it was huge, and our giant animal is usually a deer. This is central Georgia, not too far south of Lake Sinclair. We don't really have alligators either. I could scratch off every possible animal because those footsteps were massive. You would know it was much louder than any known animal if you heard them, like an elephant walking through. The footsteps finally stopped about 30 yards into the thick woods. The next thing I hear is what sounded like some kind of gibberish ritual, but it wasn't quite in words. I had never heard anything like this before. Even my wife heard it, and we were both on the upper back porch. We like to sit down and enjoy the sun setting to the west side of the lake, but it was already completely dark when we heard this thing speaking in what I could only assume was tongues. I tried using a battery-powered spotlight to see where this thing was, but with no success, as it kept saying something over and over. The next thing I know, something was thrown towards us, landing on the porch. It was about 2 to 3 pounds. It was a rock, and it was pretty big. I picked it up carefully and placed it on a small sandwich bag. It might have had some sort of fingerprint evidence, I don't know. I turned it over to professionals to get a good look at it, but I don't think anything really ever came of it. I know it might sound weird to do that, but I need to find out what's going on here and what this creature is. Earlier this morning, I began searching for professionals and only found something called cryptozoologist. Since no other known studies are based on this experience, I never told my daughters or my family about this because they wouldn't understand. My daughters are only 5 years old, and I don't want them to be traumatized by this. When cryptozoology appeared on my computer, it talked about the legendary Bigfoot, their biggest passion, and a few others known as cryptids. I'm hoping to go into the woods with my wife tomorrow to see if I can find any fingerprints, and I would love to share some pics with you if we can get anything on camera.
The Michigan Gator Man by Certified Burger. Now, before I begin this story, let me first start by clarifying that alligators are not native to Michigan, which is what made me so skeptical about believing this legend until I had an in-person encounter with him. The Michigan Gator Man. A little backstory on my family. We recently purchased a house in a small town in Michigan's Upper Thumb. Caseville, Michigan, was a quiet beach town famously known for its cheeseburger festival. It seemed like a family-friendly town and a perfect place to spend summers. Everything was excellent the first year or so living there, and then we began to hear whispers around town about the legend of what I was supposed to believe was the Gator Man. We figured it was some form of hazing that people did to new people in town and brushed it off. On the 4th of July, the town had fireworks, and about 12 of us decided to sit on the sand to view them. Our street had access to a private beach, so we were the only ones there that night. Everyone else was on the public side of the beach in the distance. My cousins and I were having a great time actually, dancing to the music and just goofing off in general. Then, we hear something coming towards us in the distance. It's a low growling sound. We stare, but we don't see much because it's very dark along the water. Either way, there's a big group of us, so we weren't too terribly threatened by it. At this point, the cricket stopped chirping, and any voices in the distance became muted. Even the waves of Lake Huron seemed to hush. It became dead silent. My cousin Kurt points toward a low growling sound, and he says that there were two yellow glowing eyes growing in size as something was coming towards us. The loud crash of fireworks pulled our attention away from whatever it was, and when we looked back, it was seemingly gone. We began watching the fireworks show and soon forgot all about it. Our attention is pulled away from the fireworks as sand flies over our heads from behind us. All of us whip our heads around to see it. A figure of a man stands in the dark. Only once the flash of fireworks illuminates him enough to see what he truly is. His skin seemed to glow in the light. He looked skinny, almost scaly. We couldn't get a great look at him because of our light source. It was flashing in and out, of course. The grand finale of the fireworks began and we glanced away for just a split second. And suddenly, a splash of the water happened. This weird man was gone. After the fireworks show ended, we all decided this was pretty creepy and didn't stay at the beach for much longer. I tried to rationalize how he looked in the light, and maybe just thought he had a nasty sunburn or some sort of, skin burns or something like that. The following day, we headed back to the beach to look for any evidence that could bring some sense to the situation, and just to be safe, we got our dog with us. What we found made our skin crawl. Leading from the sand to the water was what I could only describe as gator tracks. But here's the kicker. A piece of driftwood was floating in the water next to where the tracks led, and it looked to have some sort of odd scratches and bite marks on it. I moved to get a closer look, and my dog instantly began growling and refused to walk any closer. This made me uncomfortable enough to listen and to head back to the house as fast as possible and get as far away from these tracks as I could. That night, my cousin and I decided to go back to the beach for an evening swim, but mostly to look for the gator man. I now understand that this wasn't the brightest idea, but we were bored and wanted to figure this thing out. We reached the sand, using our phone flashlights to look for any sort of evidence, but we didn't find anything interesting, so we swam in the water. We were in the water until our cousin felt something rush up against her leg. As our initial shock was settling in, our eyes began adjusting to the dark water. We saw some air bubbles and immediately felt the tension in the air. A tall figure slowly emerges from the water in the moon's light. Those same yellow glowing eyes met mine for a not-so-appreciated second time. He was angry, and we needed to leave this water. We knew immediately this was his beach, and he had the upper hand, especially in the water. We booked it back to the house, never looking back to see if it was following us. I still can't visit that beach to this day. I still see those glowing yellow eyes when I close my own. I don't know what the Michigan Gator Man wants, but I feel sorry for those who find out.
Good evening, and thank you for sharing my story. This encounter still troubles me to this day. It was the summer of 2011. I recently had turned 12, and my family thought it would be a great summer for a cabin trip. Normally, I would have been attending some sort of Boy Scout camp. Since we are from Florida, we drove north to South Carolina with my grandparents coming down from Canada to meet us. The cabin itself was beautiful, with a great view of the lake and its own beachhead. When we first arrived, I was first out of the car and running around in excitement. I was greeted by a man looking to be in his late 50s, the cabin owner. He smiled at me with happiness, which slowly grew into a nervous grin. Finding it quite odd and being a shy kid, I moved along. As I searched around the area, being curious and wanting to see everything, I noticed almost a circular pit under the house. It was off-putting, but it didn't seem to bother me. Finally, I noticed a treehouse that the owner was building on the beach. As I ran to it, he yelled out, "Watch yourself, son. It's still dangerous." I steamed onwards and climbed up the ladder. The man was correct, as the top there were so many nails poking out all around. But since I was small, I found a place to stand and gaze back at the cabin. The wood cabin seems old but sturdy, with a big porch and outside storage underneath, where once again I stared at this circular pit, which now had my full attention. It was nothing that I've ever seen before, and I don't think I've seen something like it since. I love the woods, and would like to say I am experienced, but it almost looked like a big spinning ball was dipped into the earth. I pointed it out to my father and the owner, who was talking. The owner responded with, "There used to be a bear that nested there, but don't worry, he's long gone." I didn't like his answer, because it seemed strange for how it looked. I brushed it off and went into the cabin, picking up one of the bunk beds before my siblings could. The first few nights were amazing. Lots of hiking and swimming and everyday things that you would do, because we knew when our grandparents arrived, we would be hanging out most of the time. When they did arrive, we sat by the fire at night and enjoyed animal watching. It's important to note the area's geography at this point. The front of the cabin faced a wide strip of dirt leading to the beach with thick trees on either side. To the left of the cabin was the dirt road we used to get to it. Behind and on the left of the cabin were thick, dense woods with a steep slope. Now, it was the 7th night that we were there. I was awoken up by weird sounds outside. Dirt shifting under a weight to the left side of the cabin. The trash bins were there next to the door from the kitchen. I heard something pushing them around. Thinking it was most likely raccoons or some sort of interested animal, I should do my Boy Scout duty and shoo them off. I dropped down from my bunk and the noises went silent. I noticed a few rays of sunlight were streaking through the air. I walked over to the kitchen to look out the window, but before I could reach it, suddenly, these long, scratching noises were coming out from against the walls of the cabin. It sounded like long nails, digging deep into the sheets of a bed. Terrified at this point, I slowly back away. Then a bang shook the door and I jumped. Since it was only me, my brother, and my dog who were downstairs, we were the only ones who heard it. Instantly, my dog sprinted to the door, barking and growling viciously like he was about to fight to the death. This woke up my brother, who panicked and grabbed me and pulled out his hunting knife. He looked down at me with reassurance and told me to get to my parents' room. He then pushed me upwards towards the stairs and ran to the door and opened it. He then went away with my dog, the barks and running getting distance as I ran upstairs, and I woke up my father. He ran out into the forest with his Colt 45. About 30 minutes later, they both came back, including my dog, who was limping. I've never seen my brother with the look he had on his face before that day, and he never had that look ever again. He's typically a very brave and capable older brother, and seeing him like that unnerved me to my bone. He was an Eagle Scout, and I was a Boy Scout. We had been in the woods, and we weren't really scared to get dirty. My dog had a stick through his front left leg, but he's a good strong boy and took it like a champ. My mother and grandmother quickly drove our animal over to the local vet. While they were gone, my father, grandfather, and oldest second brother and I looked around the cabin for evidence of this strange event. I was still incredibly nervous, so I kept close to the cabin and my father. The trash bins had gashed holes in them, almost like they had been punched open, and the wall above had deep claw marks in it, which, standing from the level of the trash bins, was about 6 feet into the air. That's when I noticed a smell. An odd smell that wasn't coming from the trash cans. I slowly crouched down between peering underneath the cabin and where this strange pit was. There was a dead fox, shredded into literal pieces. I told my father, and him and my brother quickly cleaned it up by using a shovel and tossing it into a bag and then into the trash. My dad contacted the owner, who assured us that there was nothing to be worried about, but brought us a flare gun and bear mace. A couple of days go by, and my parents take everyone to a restaurant aside from myself, my oldest brother who chased the perpetrator, and my injured but stable dog. An hour after they left, I looked out the second-floor window in the direction where my brother ran a few nights prior. I was petting my dog at the same time. That's when the main encounter took place. My dog raised his head alert and sniffed the air. I glanced out the window and noticed this huge bear-like creature high up in one of the trees. It was matching my level and was staring at me. I say bear-like because it had human-like features, instead of the fat, round body bears usually have. Their body was toned, sharp, and muscular. The eyes were the worst parts. They were piercing. They were yellow, almost like perfect human eyes that locked eye contact with me. Fear flooded my brain and forced me into a fight or flight mindset. My dog, picking up on this, started growling and howling at the window. I turned to run into the room and looked back at the creature who was now rapidly descending the tree, using its clawed hand to climb. I sprinted to my brother's room in tears, yelling about this beast that I just saw. My brother looked at me with worried eyes and said, "This territory doesn't belong to us." Then he got out of his bed, grabbed his knife and baseball bat, and walked downstairs. I armed myself with a flare gun and bear mace, and prepared myself for the possibility of this thing breaking in and attacking us. A great slam into the back of the wall knocked the cabin around. It made it rock like a boat and sent my dog into a frenzy. Between the growls and barks, I could hear heavy breathing from outside and things being thrown at the cabin. A rock broke one of the front windows and striking my left leg. I turned and fired the flare gun out of the window, which was followed by many profanities and yelling. After this, it all stopped. My dog was still growling and pointing at the corner of the room. There was no window facing that direction, so I couldn't see, but I could assume it was right there. A few minutes of silence went by when my brother and I decided to call the police and our parents. Then, being idiots, we walked out of the front door and slowly walked around to the right side of the cabin. We started to hear a slow snarl coming from behind a bush, and my dog inside started going ballistic and jumping at the door. My brother started yelling at this creature and threw his baseball bat towards the bush, striking it. It sounded like it hit a tree, but we both know that we hit the creature because it let out a pained grunt. The black furry mass sprung out from behind the bush and bolted down the dirt road, and we quickly lost sight of it. We hurried back inside the cabin, barricaded the doors, and ran upstairs. We heard gunshots ring out moments later, and my father's truck pulls in. I fly downstairs and open the door. The rest of my family ran inside, and my father claimed a huge bear ran down the road, and he fired a couple of rounds at it. The police eventually came after having a hard time finding the cabin. We gave them the story about this aggressive bear attacking the cabin. We left that night, and my family likes to recall the story of how myself and my oldest brother fended off a hungry bear. But for me and my brother, that was not the case. When we arrived back in Florida, I went straight to my room, still shaken up by what happened. When my brother came in, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "It looked human, didn't it?" I just nodded and asked him about his territory remark when he looked down and responded, "Every animal has its territory, and usually can keep it until something bigger comes along and takes it." Well, something bigger came and it took its own territory. What he said still makes me wonder to this day. It's burned into my mind. Looking back on it, the owner was so shaky around me, almost like he knew there was more danger in the area than he was letting on, and that he knew that we would be a target.
Something Stalked Our Campsite by M.J. Hello, Swamp Dweller, and anyone who may be listening to this. I'm a long-time listener, but this is the first story I have ever submitted. It has bothered and spooked me for almost a year now, and I would love any input that anyone has on it. Last year, around June, I was camping in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, with my boyfriend James and his friend Lane. We were generally having a good time, hanging by the creek, building a fire, and listening to groovy tunes. We continued to hang out into the night, and were all partaking in some drinking. This makes the next part of the story seem unbelievable, but trust me, it was just as incredible to us at the time, and we were there. We were all sitting around the fire when James and Lane spotted a small fire off in the distance. This was strange since we hadn't noticed anyone camping nearby all day. We ignored it for a bit and continued having a good time until we all went to sleep around midnight. I remember waking up sometime a little bit later feeling immediately confused and frozen with fear. It was still dark, I turned to James, who was already sitting up and listening intently. I heard sticks cracking just outside the tree line, just outside of the tent. I realized that there was either a person or some sort of creature walking around outside. Couldn't tell you if it was a bear, a wendigo, or some sort of freaking spaghetti monster. All I know is that we sat up, frozen in silence, and unsure if we should be afraid or not. Suddenly, I heard someone attempt to open my car door. It was locked. I heard 2 distinct pulls on the handle, and then an urgent whispering. James and I froze. Well, we thought it had to be people at this point, and Lame was alone in his tent about 15 feet away. We sat waiting for whoever this was to leave, with bated breath. I was terrified, because of what happened next. I swear, these voices, they sounded human, but the way they were going back and forth almost made them sound ethereal. This was something weird. The whispers initially started with things like, this was a bust and these guys didn't have anything suitable to steal or something along those lines. Then, we heard a third voice come out of nowhere saying, maybe we check the tents. Frozen in fear again, we waited as long as we could, in full anxiety mode. My mind was relieved that I heard their heavy footsteps approaching the fire that we had seen earlier. Now you might be wondering why I'm sending this in under the cryptid category. Well, that's because in the morning, when we looked out to see if there was any sort of footprints or anything like that, there were none. No footprints, no feet prints, no shoe prints, nothing. Also, when I said that the voices sounded ethereal, it almost sounded like they were whispering right in our ears, but somehow we could hear them all the way across to where our car was. And on top of that, we did hear a lot of rumors about, gnomes, fairies, trolls, all sorts of weird things that are said to roam these sorts of areas. So maybe it was something like that. Or maybe it was just a band of thieves who were incredibly light-footed. I couldn't tell you. What I can say is, though, we were all super freaked out, since those people, creatures, or whatever could have severely hurt us if they wanted to. But we were relieved that they thought of our stuff as worthless or whatever. We decided we would not be camping anytime soon in that area, though.
The Weirdest Halloween Ever by Pample Moose. Here in England, we don't do Halloween like you do in the United States. At least we don't in Bolton, a sub-district of Manchester. A few children dressed in bin bag capes with witches' hats on or a skeleton mask will knock on your door, holding up little pumpkin buckets out for sweets, and some neighbors will put out some sort of paper gravestones in their windows. They go a little bit with it, but that's about it. Last October 31st, 2022, however, the weirdest thing happened at our home. Our family were all sitting at the front of the TV watching the Exorcist movie when a hammer was at the back door. We all stopped and looked at it, and then looked at each other. To knock at the back door, you would have had to got through a wrought iron side gate, which is always firmly locked. The knocking continued, getting louder and more urgent. My grandson, who is 15, got up and went to the kitchen window to investigate. I heard a stifled gasp and went to join him to see what was happening. Despite being a teenager, he is 6 feet tall and does boxing training, so he's no real little weakling. I joined him at the window and asked what was the matter. Face pale and confused, he said a massive bird-like creature had crawled along the lawn and crept into the corner of the garden near the back fencing. He was visibly shaken. The car park to a country park nature trail is at the back of our fence, so I immediately thought some local kids were having a Halloween joke and jumped the wall. Despite it being 8 feet high, I thought maybe they were just pranking us. I told my grandson to tell the rest of the family what we had seen, and I told him I would check it out. He panicked, and I heard him shout to the rest of them still watching TV. He was shaken up at the crawling creature he had thought he had seen, truly. I grabbed a torch and went out into the garden. We have a lot of mature trees, shrubs, and bushes, and at the corner of the garden, I heard a rustling. I pointed the torch toward the noise and walked towards it. There, with its back against the fence, was a bird-like creature about the size of a small child. It was perched on a grassy mound with eagle-like talons for feet, a smooth body, outstretched wings, and a pointy face that resembled a giant rat. I was confused and walked towards it while it looked at me, with its head downwards but eyes looking up at me. It spread its wings and they fluttered like a bird when it was ready to take off. Then there was a prolonged hissing sound. I stopped and looked behind me for backup. I saw a few family members coming out into the garden. The thing gave one last hiss, rose into the air, looking more like a gargoyle than a bird at this point, and disappeared over the fence. It made some of the shrubs waver as it went. My grandson and I described what we had seen, but the rest of them laughed and said it was just our imagination. They admitted to seeing the shrubs swaying, but they put it down to a giant kestrel or something. They didn't believe a word of it. To this day, I do not go into the back garden after dark. That was not a local kid enjoying a Halloween prank, nor was it a visiting kestrel. It looked like a church gargoyle. It's never been back, and I don't want it to return. So this year, if there's a knocking at our back door, my husband or son can investigate this time. I prefer lavender and lilac in my garden over cryptic creatures. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14 years old. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people I'd known my entire life. We were all very close and knew each other very, very well, and trusted each other. We had been hiking for 5 days or so at this point, and it was pretty miserable. It rained every single day, and we were all exhausted and sore, and hungry. We were covered with blisters and anything else you could imagine. The adults realized we had bitten off a bit more than we could chew in trying to do a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather. So we changed course and had gotten off trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground, the kind of place with hookups for RVs and picnic tables and fire pits and such. There's also a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or any other house. There may have been a few other small groups there, but if there were, we never interacted with them or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including myself and my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group we had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods, up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, I followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise from my left. I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off the trail. The kind of pump where you raise and lower a handle to pump up water from a well. There was a strange light behind him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods off the trail. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of, sad. He said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there. I heard Jeremy talking in from the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them exactly what happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot. This was long before any of us had experience with any kind of mind-altering substances, but I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and we knew that we wouldn't exaggerate or play a joke on each other like this, at least not to this extent. I was physically shaking. It was almost impossible for this to be a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot. Then we all walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot, whoever I had seen was gone without a trace. The water pump was there, though. No one had noticed it before because it was way off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed, thoroughly freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night, and all my years since then, I've never been able to figure out what happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? This is unlikely. Did I hallucinate? Unlikely, but possible. Who's to say?
Mississippi Dogman by Pam M. Hey, swamp dweller. My name is Pam. I live on the northeast corner of Mississippi, less than 10 miles from the Tennessee and Alabama state lines, and 70 miles from the infamous Taylor, Mississippi. A granddaughter, who is 11 years old, had an encounter with the cryptid a few months ago. Let me describe what happened and what she witnessed. Sometime around 11 p.m. we returned home from the county fair here in Alcorn County, Mississippi. My home is approximately 6 miles from town in a relatively rural area containing lakes, trees, and fields used for anything from tomatoes to soybeans and even cotton. My land is almost 20 acres. We have our home, a barn, a shed, and a lake about 200 yards from my house. The rest is trees and a few cleared out pieces. Anyway, back to Saturday night. A granddaughter, A, decided to walk outside to find her kitty before she went to bed. A husband and I were already in bed, and why she went out without waking one of us shocked me, but she didn't wake any of us up. She didn't even wake us up when she returned after seeing this thing. She did get in bed with us and slept with us that night and the next night. However, the following day, while fixing breakfast, she walked into the kitchen and said, "Mama Pam, y'all have some kind of strange dog out there." I asked her what she was talking about, and here is her answer. "When I went outside to find Kitty, I started walking to the front yard and saw something huge in lights. I thought it was a dog. When I got closer, it looked more like an old, bad, skinny grandpa. She was walking on his hands and legs, and then it got up on its back 2 legs. It looked around and it saw me, then it ran toward the barn. Pam, I ain't never seen anything run that fast." I asked her if she had seen the face of this thing, but she told me that she did not. She didn't get to see it long enough to see any real features. She said it only looked toward her for just a few seconds, and it was too dark to make out any discernible facial features besides that it was bald. I know my eyes were as big as saucers. I knew what she had seen wasn't anything from around here. She told me it was very skinny and again bald, and it looked like it had trouble even walking on all 4s, making it hard for her to believe that it could run so fast. She said on all 4s it was jerky, but it wasn't like that when it was on just 2 legs. I told them I thought it was a crawler. I could not believe she didn't come screaming for me and my husband to wake up. She said at the time, and in her 11-year-old mind, she didn't consider it harmful because it was frail and seemed to have such a hard time walking. But she did say that when it took off toward the barn, it was a lightning fast. She said that's when she got nervous. She returned to bed with my husband and me when she saw how fast it actually was. I know she's telling me the truth because she's never been exposed to anything that would even remotely give her an idea for this story. Not to mention, she doesn't really lie, to be honest, and she slept with me and my husband for the next few nights as well. She's really not a kid to make up things. She's down to earth, a cheerleader, a soccer player, a softball player, and an all-around, well-rounded kid. I hope somebody listening to this in the swamp can answer these following questions. Have any of you ever heard these creatures anywhere else around Mississippi, Tennessee, or the Alabama areas? She has a 4-wheeler, a bicycle, and does a lot of outdoor activities. I'm scared to let her go do those now. Are we in danger? Thanks for sharing my story. Too afraid to go outside by myself now as well. Many people believe what they perceive in the world is reality. Everything they see, touch, smell, and hear is real, and will always be real. This always goes for things that they don't believe in. We live in a world where they no longer fear the monsters in the dark, believing we have discovered all the apex predators of the world, such as the sharks, the orcas, the bears, the wolves, and large cats, and we believe we are on the top of the food chain. While it is true, we currently have no natural predators, we are merely prey of opportunity. This doesn't change the fact that we are prey nonetheless. One doesn't get to experience the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked like a wolf stalks an elk. The feeling of dread you feel as the eyes of a predator are staring into you, waiting for you to make one wrong move. I was 14 at the time. I had short black hair and braces that made me look like the biggest dork you have ever met in your life. Funny enough, I was. While I played lacrosse and was semi-athletic, what I lacked in coordination and speed I made up for with a deceiving amount of brute strength, an amount that didn't make sense for my small stature. I was in Phoenix, Arizona for my annual summer trip to visit my grandparents on my father's side of the family. My grandparents seemed like opposites. My grandfather is a tall, semi-muscular man, standing at 6 feet 6 inches in height and weighing easily over 190 pounds, who never seemed to take anything seriously and loved to crack joke and tease others. My grandmother was tall for a woman, standing at easily 5 feet 9 inches, was rather skinny. She didn't make jokes often but always seemed to laugh at my grandfather's jokes. The only similarities I ever felt like they really shared was their love for their family and their love for going on walks and hiking. They also owned a beautiful dog named Lucy. Lucy was a rescue when my grandparents got her, and such she came with their own issues. She was a fond of bigger men and hated big dogs, yet somehow that didn't seem to stop her from loving any of the men in my family, including my grandfather. If he saw Lucy from a distance, you'd think it was just a large fox. Her fur was the orange color foxes have, and her tail looked just like a fox. In truth, no one knew what breed she was. Even after having become a registered veterinarian assistant, I still have no good guess. The only thing I know for sure is that she at least shares some part of German Shepherd, as she shares the same common characteristics they have, including the medium size, pointed ears, snout, and her love and undying devotion to her owners. The morning after I arrived at my grandmother's, they told me that they were going to hike up Camelback Mountain, a mountain that got its name for looking like a camel's hump. I hated the idea of doing this. Like most high schoolers, I just wanted to lay in bed and watch YouTube, especially since this would be the first year I didn't have my brother Jalen to keep me company. Jalen was my older brother, who had 6 years on me. He had just turned 20 and decided he needed to work to save up money for when he goes back to campus, leaving me to go on a trip by himself. I wasn't upset. Obviously, this is a decision he needed to make, but I was sad about it. Up until 8th grade, he had been my only real friend that I could really rely on and open up to. As I was sitting in the car with my grandmother, I remember staring out the window, admiring the scorching sun, and listening to the steady panting of Lucy in the back. I looked up into the rearview mirror in hopes of seeing her smiling face and instilling confidence in me. I yawned and rolled onto my side, facing the passenger side of the car, and closed my eyes. While I slept, I remember reflecting on the story my grandfather on my mother's side of the family told me a few months ago. These grandparents only lived a few hours south of my family, so I visited them more often. My grandfather, who I will refer to as Papaw to help separate the two, is a short, overweight man who loved his grandchildren more than life itself, but he took a liking to me more than anyone else. I think the reason for this was because I took the time to listen to his story. Papaw had served in Vietnam when he was younger and had numerous stories to tell, a few of which were almost unsettling. He told me of creatures, the likes of which we humans have never seen before, living in the jungles there. He told me how the creature was more dangerous than the Viet Cong soldier or animal or anything like that. He also gave me survival tips in case I ever found myself stuck in the woods and felt unsafe. If you ever feel like you're being stalked by something, do not run. Prey runs. His voice echoed in my head. Don't ever scream, prey screams. If you see the creature stalking you, do not meet its gaze. Most animals take that as you challenging it, and while humans are extremely capable creatures, being able to rely on adrenaline to take down a lot of animals, there are creatures in this world that will butcher us without hesitating. His words seemed to burn themselves into my head. All you need to do is make yourself look as big as possible and walk out of his territory as fast as possible while still walking. The last of his words echoed as I felt someone shaking my body a little bit. "We're here, Josh. It's time to wake up," I heard my grandmother say while rocking my body back and forth. We both got out of the car, and I gave Lucy the treats I had promised her. As I stood outside the car holding Lucy's leash, I breathed in the fresh air. It smelled quite different from Indiana, as it didn't carry the swamp smell Indiana's humidity usually carries with it. The air was much thinner, making me more confident that I wouldn't be able to run nearly as far as I would be able to at home. As we walked along the trail, my grandmother and I side by side with Lucy leading the way ahead of us, I made idle talk with her as we walked down the trail. The mountains were beautiful. While one would imagine it just to be a barren desert there are specific parts of arid trees and cacti that turn into a sort of forest that, combined with the beautiful blue skies and warm, almost boiling hot weather, made it a beautiful day to hike. As we continued to walk, I felt this sense of dread growing inside of me. The further we went, I looked down to Lucy, whose ears were now up and alert. Her body was low to the ground. She sensed something near us. I began to feel uneasy. The mountains of Arizona had many creatures inhabiting it, which include black bear, mountain lions, elk, deer, javelina, coyote, antelope, along with a lot more. I looked at my grandmother, who didn't seem bothered at all. This feeling of dread grew bigger and bigger. The weight of it sitting on my chest. Something was staring at me. I could feel it piercing my soul. I recalled my papa's advice and attempted to make myself look as big as possible, which admittedly wasn't very big at all. My goal was to make myself seem like I just wasn't worth the trouble. I looked around, trying to spot anything out of place when I saw it. Peering around from behind a cactus was some sort of creature, covered in black fur. I couldn't see its body because it was behind the giant cactus, but I could tell it was easily as tall as this cactus was. This thing was easily 7 feet tall. I tried to avoid its gaze, not wanting to accidentally challenge it, but it felt as though my eyes snapped to them on their own. Its eyes were black. Not black, but more like they were completely void of light, except for a small amount of yellow. Their eyes were beady and honestly soulless. The longer I looked, I noticed this giant hand reaching around the front of the cactus. Its hands was big enough to fit my head inside of it, and it had 2-inch claws at its fingertips. My head snapped away from it, and I looked ahead. Grandma would need to turn around and leave. I said, trying not to show fear, but wanting to get the urgency across. "Oh, but we haven't made it halfway yet," my grandmother said with the sound of sadness in her voice. I needed to come up with something to get us out of there. I looked down to Lucy, who was still walking forward, but her head wasn't looking ahead. She was looking at my right, the direction I saw the monster watching us from. "Grandma, I don't feel good. My stomach hurts and I feel nauseous. Can we please just go back? I promised we could take Lucy on a walk a little bit later," I said, trying to sound as sick as possible. "I guess that is fine," my grandmother said almost disappointingly, as she really wanted to take me to the peak this year. When we turned around, I made sure to keep myself between where I had seen the monster and my grandmother. As we walked back down, feeling the dread continued to get worse. This feeling of hopelessness, that you are no longer the scariest out there anymore. That at any moment's notice, something could decide to take you out of this world. When we got back to the car, I noticed we were still the only ones out there, which is strange, as it was usually a place to go hiking that was very popular. Lucy reluctantly got back into the SUV, preferring to stay outside and keep watch while my grandmother got in the car. While I finally got Lucy in, and I got myself in, I looked ahead on the trail. There was something, somewhat obscured by the foliage. It was a hulking animal of some sort. It had the face of a dog with its long black snout, but was easily bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen before. It stared at me, into my soul once again, but it never moved, only stared at me, which was almost scarier than it charging us. We went back home, where I sat in my room and immediately called my papa. Honestly, he would be the only one that would believe me. 2 days later, my grandmother told me she had seen something weird on the news of a few hikers going missing on that very same trail. She thanked me for convincing us to leave. I still have never, ever gone back to those mountains. Even as I've gotten bigger and more experienced hunting and such, I just don't trust it. I now carry a serrated pocket knife that my papa had given me for my 15th birthday everywhere I go. I will never forget the advice he had given me.
Visions of Death by Sam. This story takes place when I was 16 years old. I had just been dropped off at school and I was going to the cafeteria. I went to sit with my best friend, Jack. When I looked at Jack, I saw this creature that resembled a person but was covered in darkness. It had no face or discernible features. He was standing right behind him with his hands on his shoulder, not forcefully, but just like resting. Its head then turned to me and followed me as I approached him. He asked me why I looked so spooked. I told him nothing because he didn't believe in the paranormal. He was a firm Christian, so anything I would have said, it would have just called me crazy. We went throughout the day, and every time I saw him, it was right there with his hands on his shoulder. When I got home, I asked my mom what it could be, or if my great-grandma might know. My mom told me she calls them reapers. They're not necessarily malicious or anything, they just comfort those who are going to die. I broke into tears after hearing this and ran to my room. I ended up passing out, and while I was asleep, I had a dream of my friend's point of view. He was in our friend Todd's vehicle, and he looked like he was listening to a speaker in the back seat, not buckled in. Todd crashed into a tree, Jack went through the windshield and snapped his neck, and then I woke up screaming. My mom and sister came in to see if I was okay. I said I was fine and I just had a bad dream. Nothing to worry about. The next day was a Friday and the Reaper followed Jack. I told Jack about my dream, thinking maybe I could warn him about what would happen. But I thought he would just call me crazy. The Reaper looked at me and shook its head. I wonder why it did this. Maybe it was telling me that I couldn't or shouldn't interfere. I ignored that it was there for the rest of the day and went about my business until around 5 p.m. My friend called me and asked if I wanted to go to a party. I said, yeah, just come get me, and we'll go. He told me he had a ride, and Todd would be there. I screamed at him, no, don't get in Todd's truck. He told me to chill. He said he was on the way and hung up. So I went on my way to the front porch for him, hoping that my dream wouldn't be real. But after an hour of waiting, my mom got a call and told me what I hoped not to hear. He had died to basically the exact same play-by-play I saw in my dream. I turned around and the Reaper was standing in front of me. It put a hand on my shoulder. I screamed at it to leave me alone, and it just disappeared just as it appeared. I don't know what happened. My dream came true, and it's something I'll always scratch my head about. I don't know what that creature was, if it really was a Reaper, quote-unquote, or some sort of, afterlife messenger, I don't know. But I don't want to find out.